This episode 141 Caribbean Rhythms, and you may have seen yet more articles about me this week. And I am vain enough to enjoy widespread attention on myself for weeks and weeks. I can't complain. This time it concerned political, as this latest article on me, in case you haven't seen, there's almost one every week now. I don't know what causes this increased attention lately. I can only speculate. By the way, this show, I continue to talk about romantic and social life of ancient Greek men, and so I will only spend, maybe just opening a segment, humor my narcissism as I talk about myself and the attention showered on me. Once again, I'm in the news. You will have noticed, though it's been like this for some months now, the general pattern was supposed conservative. Interns, for example, at National Review and such, oddly getting to write about me in Daily Beast, or Sohrab of Compact magazine writing about the neo-Gnostic menace, the Nietzschean pagan menace, in the New Statesman. That's right. Online establishment Christians get very worked up about 5 people writing about Nietzsche and paganism, and who like Homer, after their religion has been replaced by worship of the Holocaust. That does not concern them. But anyway, there is, before this recent Politico article, there is this new trend of conservatives attacking the frog right, usually in far-left publications, and should raise an eyebrow. Why is this National Review striver working for the Daily Beast, an Antifa publication? Someone made this joke. I predict Romney will be writing in Mother Jones in 2024 spring about the dastardly urbanite, decadent racist Bronze Age pervert, how we must reject him for family values. It's serious business. An anonymous account, you'd think, right? I have relatively small reach in media. Vast majority of people don't know about me, so why? Why now? Why this strangeness with the conservacock, the same GOP lame old boomers panicking that they've been panicking since Trump era and so on. Everywhere you see the GOP boomer fingerprints on the attacks against me. In the East Bloc, there was something called the Komsomol. This was a communist youth kind of cadre, party-aspiring striver apparatchiks. They existed even in the 1980s when it was clear things were on their way out. Imagine being Communist Youth Party aspiring cadet in 1984, right? It's like being National Review or Weekly Standard intern right now. Or Compact, same garbage. So these, you can imagine, the type of people, right? It's the worst kind of kiss-ass careerist, the kind of brown-noser for a sclerotic old party guard and late-stage communism, and not even a good career at that. I mean, it pays nothing. And that's the type of people attacking me now for some reason. So it's either, as I say, conservatives, oddly enough, writing in far-left publications, the New Statesman and so on, or these conservative rags, they hire an outright Antifa, really, for example, hardcore whiteness studies type Antifa from Sweden, and they rely on people not Google translating this person's articles that are in Swedish to see how he kvetches about whiteness and such. And such creature now writes for supposedly dissident right or dissident populist right magazines in America. And most of the output is again trying to dox, harass anonymous posters and such. And really to do what Antifa does, to raise up a mob against them or their families, to police the right so that no original ideas actually get through to outside world. So they hope, but they make mistake because I have already bigger reach than their paltry circulation anyway. So that's not the matter, but I just bring up to you the oddity of it all, the conservative Antifa collaboration, which if you listen to my show, I've talked about this for a while, but there's long been establishment conservative collaboration with Antifa against me and also my friends, the faction of truth, you see. Because I'm not right-wing or left. I'm not a dissident. I just want the truth. I just want to speak the truth. These people are dissidents against the truth and good taste also, I might add. I'm a moderate centrist. That's me, and a liberal. I'm a liberal moderate centrist. I should go back to East Bloc and make a party in a particular country that does not at the moment have any interesting parties. I will call it the moderate centrist party. But that said, it's funny, the unspoken part of all these hit pieces on me from all sides is how they recycle the so-called research that was commissioned by one Luke Turner against me. And this is an Antifa, a major Antifa donor, funder, call it whatever you want, in London. That's where a lot of this comes out of. But these articles, they never acknowledge the source, right? And nobody else, it's all hush-hush. The original hit pieces that came out against me from his immediate Antifa employees got almost no views, but it's actually that so-called research that gets recycled. And so far, at least 2 European Marxists who are pretending in American context to be dissident populists, they have recycled Luke Turner Antifa so-called research on me. Nobody calls them out. Which, by the way, I've told you long ago that I never address that. I would never confirm or deny these kind of petty doxing attacks on me and such, except to say that, yes, it appears many art girls and other such girls of high taste girls from New York scene and other world think I am good looking, and beyond that also like me, especially for what I say, which, okay, I'll get to that in a moment about, but you'll see why I bring this up. But all I can do now is call out the oddity of it all, the context of these articles. And I hear there are also other articles coming out against me soon from other big publications. We'll see if they get cancelled or if they go ahead with them. So on one hand, it's to be expected, I think, because on one hand, it's very odd that there haven't been more mass media articles about me, you know. My book is maybe one of best-selling, maybe the best-selling, certainly far-reaching, right-wing, so-called, if you want to claim that, book, but okay, in the last few years for sure, I do far better than any normie conservative book, okay? You look at Amazon ranks and such, and for 5 years now, a bit more than 5 years, and yes, I know friends are eagerly awaiting next book, it will come, and more than one. But so 5 years and almost no articles covering this after they were claiming for a long time that they, well, what is this frog thing? We want to see a book. We want to see a statement coming out of this sphere online. And, well, here it was. But no, it was untouchable. It was given the silent treatment. Mike Anton bravely covered it in Claremont in 2019, but that was one case. And maybe you're not aware, but Claremont has a tiny circulation. And it was even tinier at the time. I personally, just me alone, without frog friends, had far more eyes on me at the time than Claremont did, because my book had already been doing very well from the day it came out. One point of correction on these articles, the only thing maybe I will address, the only factoid, they keep bringing up the Amazon rankings, but maybe conveniently forget that actually it got up to about rank 100 the days it came out, the week it came out. That's site-wide, okay? And that's like all the books, I mean, everywhere on Amazon, rank 100 out of them, and it stayed around 100 to 200, so around there for a bit. And for a self-published book with no publicity, no parties, nothing, no marketing, I think that's quite notable, but mostly it was ignored by media. And how many publishers do you think I've had after this so-called proof of concept, right? How many of them have gotten in touch with me, right? 0. Not that I need them. A traditional publisher will keep the money, you know, but it's odd, right? Or rather, it's not odd at all. Almost total media silence, except for, again, occasional rare mendacious hit piece on me or one line. There's this odd guy here and there. After Anton wrote his review, for example, there was another political article. The one this week is the second. The first one was in fall 2019. And I have to tell you, that was such a nasty article. I immediately left United States at the time when that came out. I had mostly already not been living in America. And aside from a quick visit, I think at beginning of pandemic, I've basically been outside United States for all these years. But all I can do is call them out. What were they trying to do there? Both political pieces on me, the one this week and the one in 2019, try to make me out to be a security threat. So in this one, the journalist clumsily tries to tie me to some retard mass shooter. Okay, so let me tell you about this. I think Roman McClay was his name. It's one of these absurd things because it's one of rare cases where it can actually be proven more or less that the actions of this retard had nothing at all to do with me, right? In many cases, you can't really prove it. There's some retard shooter, they're playing a video game. Is it caused by the video game? Is it you can't really show one way or another. But what she describes at the end of this article, she fails to mention that this Maroon had described his murders very precisely in his own book, which was written years before he was ever aware of me. And these murders had, as far as I know, nothing to do with politics or ideology. It was just some schizophrenic personal matter of his. And that, again, he tried to make some kind of artistic, whatever you want to call it. It's not artistic, but it's a retard description that he made some years before. So this kind of cheap smears, let me throw at the wall. Let's see if what we can make stick. I'm guessing that her editor, let me be fair to this girl who wrote the article, maybe her editor tried to force her to include that. She just tried to make me out to look like vampire or whatever. But I've heard this before. The editor interjects, says you can't just say these things, you have to say something really nasty. Elizabeth Brunig, I think her name is, who wrote for Washington Post, I think, and she wanted to do a piece on Frog Twitter, that's me and my friends, and really the small group that went by that particular name at the center of things in around 2015 or so. And while I don't agree with Elizabeth Brunig's take, what I know of what she was going to say, she was trying to make it out to be a literary movement like the beatniks or whatever, but she didn't seem to have bad intentions. In a world where everything's lame and boring, we're about the most interesting things around for smart people who like books and movies and so on. But she told me that she could not publish that in the Washington Post because the editor insisted that she connect us to the so-called Unite the Right retard rallies. And I have to grant her this, she was honest enough then to refuse the whole thing, and she did not go through with it. She knew there was no connection between my friends and me and these chimp political rallies. But that's how mass media works. They are not allowed to mention us without smearing us in some way like this. And this week also, I hear it's going around in emails and such now, there is a Washington Post piece too that also mentions my book. And again, it has to go through the rote ritual of calling it violent, anti-Semitic, sexist, racist, or whatever. Basically, let's come up with all the keywords to get law enforcement on the back of this guy, and try to make things hard for him. And that's the point of all these articles. All I can do is try to call it out. In 2019, as I tell you, it was maybe even worse. And that spooked me because they were trying to make the case in that article, Politico that is, that I was at the center of a conspiracy based in the White House to corrupt the American military. And I've heard since from soldiers who've had disciplinary problems, unrelated ones, or who have been court-martialed, again, for unrelated reasons, that actually someone of major general or similar rank came up to them during proceedings to try to get them to talk about my book, and not like, hey, did you happen to read this, but very aggressively, you read this, right? You and your friends read this, and to try to enter it into the military, the martial court record, So, I don't want a JAG investigation of myself as a foreign influence operator to corrupt our armed forces and so on. So I left the country because of that and similar articles, and all I can do, my friends, is call out what I see their plan to be, to call out the lies and such that they're trying to do to me. So do not get misled by the one or two words of praise they may give. I am vain, but not that vain. Yes, who doesn't enjoy seeing themselves in print? But they do have to put some spice on their slander, to give the air of even-handedness. And also maybe to explain plausibly why my book did well. Even they have to admit it's funny. It's fun to read. Otherwise, they can't explain why it spread. When you write an article for a publication with a legal department, you're somewhat constrained, at least a little bit they are for now, so they can't do things like claim that Peter Thiel is secretly buying up my books and laundering money to me through fake book sales, which, or that the Mossad is, or other such things that these same people, by the way, come online to say on their alts, their SOC accounts. Oh yes, you didn't know, C. Bradley Thompson, the Rangeoid head of the Koch Center at Clemson University, who wrote something like 10 to 14 articles about me, is basically my stalker. But my friend Lomez basically showed almost irrefutably that this man, C. Bradley Thompson, who calls me fascist in articles, also comes online under an anonymous account to go into chat rooms and say that BAP is not a real fascist because he doesn't tell people to go out into the streets. So you see how this game works. But I should add an unrelated tangent regarding these rumors about Thiel. I happen to like Thiel. Peter Thiel, I think he's a good man doing good things. But now he has an unearned, a not earned reputation as a funder and eminence grise and secret manipulator of the right by supposedly funding media campaigns or accounts such as mine or of my friends or others, which he doesn't deserve because in fact he never has. He is an incredibly cautious man. I've heard he funds some people. They are not my friends or friends of mine. They are rather safe people. And again, I'm not saying this to be patronizing to him. I happen to genuinely like him, but he does not deserve credit for what me and my friends do. He's never funded Frog Twitter, not ever. And though, frankly, we would have gladly taken his money in 2016 or 2017, when I needed it, I would have taken it. I'm not ashamed to say that. But they never offered it to us or to anybody similar. And people make similar claims about the Red Scare girls, for example. But as far as I know, they were also never funded by Thiel. And frankly, I don't need it now. I don't think they do either. That's another thing. People who make claims like these have no idea what these kinds of things entail. For example, how much money is normally offered and so on. But it's not something that would change my circumstances in the slightest at the moment, But no, Thiel has never funded anything very edgy at all. He funds rather normie things, if I may say, and I don't say that to attack him. But again, he has not earned this reputation that's now built up around him as dark funder of online billionaire Nazism or whatever idiocy people repeat. But anyway, back to these articles about me. Their intention is generally bad, even when it's not the intention necessarily of the journalist. It's forced on them by an editor or something like that. And it's entirely possible that the journalist may be intrigued by me and may even like the things I say. They are meant to be seductive. They are seductive, if I may praise myself. I don't know of another Nietzschean call to life on order of what I did in, yes, this silly humor internet book. But not recently anyway. I don't know anything like that. So yes, I am proud of that. It should get attention. I think it is. And so this is one explanation. There are two explanations I'm telling you for why I'm getting this attention now, which to me, speaking in the abstract, I don't really understand why. I don't see anything online that's different or what I've been doing different. So I keep asking, why now? Why now? Well, there is an innocent explanation and a not innocent. The worst case scenario is what my friend, the bureaucrat, and others think, that these are, by the way, the bureaucrat and others who are telling me this are not especially paranoid people, by the way, like me. But if you study the Durham report and how American law enforcement works now, if you look what they did to Trump, and they use the same tactic against smaller people like myself too, not just Trump. But this is what they do. They seed articles in mainstream media as a pretext for an investigation. So what I'm concerned about now most is some moron, ambitious prosecutor, words and reasons and laws mean nothing. They can twist anything. Try being talking to customer service in the United States lately. See how that goes. And that's, I think, slowly becoming the judiciary too. They may as well outsource the judiciary to Guadalajara call center. It's same level of service, same level of reasoning. Words mean nothing. But they can use these articles, as they have previously for Trump and many others. They use them to get probable cause in court and for investigations and so on. And many of these journalists, they're hacks. They make shit money anyway, so they often work as CHS, that's a confidential human source, I think it means. Stasi nation, you see. You never talk to a journalist off record, by the way. There is not such thing as off the record. So you take a lawyer, okay? In theory, a lawyer will lose his license if he betrays personal information that he talk you in his professional capacity, but there are no such standards for a journalist, legal or professional standards. And since many do work as confidential human source for this or that branch of government, what happens is they can leak what you told them to FBI or whatever equivalent, after which it finds its way again back into media through another journalist picks it up from that source saying it's confirmed by a high-level source in such and such agency, and so it appears verified now in another media outlet. So there's not such thing as off the record. But anyway, this could be maybe worst-case scenario explanation for these articles, that there's some type of crossfire hurricane investigation of me. Then there is the innocent explanation, which I prefer and is probably truer, and that's from what I hear. My popularity of my book is spreading offline. It's spreading in quarters that are not online, or they're not on Twitter or really any place like this, so you cannot see them easily for now, but primarily in three important segments of American society I hear. One, Silicon Valley, which I think I've mentioned before. I have gentlemen in tech who like me and who give me rumors sometimes, and I hear of many names in that world who like me, and they're not small names either, very big names, and also CEOs and such who listen to my show while they go to gyms or and many such, and my book spreading and such. And I've told you before similar reasoning. Some time back, I never understood why I was getting obsessed over and attacked by some people I had nothing to do with, who had imagined themselves as advisors to Silicon Valley and tech gurus and such. And I see them all of a sudden attack me out of nowhere. I didn't understand why. Then someone tell me it's because the audience they were courting actually liked me and not them. And it made it worse for them that I did not even seek this audience, though I welcome like-minded people from anywhere. And second, and this newer development, I hear my book and such is spreading among art world, centered around New York and such. And this is not really, by the way, the photos of parties or similar that you are seeing come out of there lately. I think that scene, the parties, I'm friendly to what they're trying to do. There's obviously a felt need, but the parties need work. To be honest, they need professional help. They need an impresario. I mentioned this to Moldbug on recent episode. With all due respect, he's not a socialite or impresario, and they need a skilled impresario. They need maybe also millions of dollars to make those parties glamorous and such. That said, is not my business, and I'm not talking about that scene, which from what I hear, include many people who want to live as artists or want to be part of an artistic scene but don't really produce art so much. Whereas what I mean here, telling you, I hear from real artist types who produce things that they are interested in me and so on. So fashion designers doing show inspired by what I say maybe, or young artists reading Schopenhauer because I talking and many such things. It's very nice to hear. And this would attract journalist attention, you see, because these journalists want to move in the same world I'm talking about now. They want to also jealously guard it. And you can imagine why, if smart people that they respect, if they talk about me, then they go into a kind of panic mode, or they write these articles about me where, they can't be completely dismissive, because then they would sound like truly the lying hacks they actually are. But their intention is still to gatekeep, to control flow information, and ultimately to try to smear, to do PR against of what they see as somebody infringing on their turf. Although, really, it's highly insulting for me to think that such nobodies think they are able to compete with me. In fact, everyone knows their brains are empty. They offer nothing but the harvest of a barren sea. And yes, that is flowery Arab rhetoric line I took from Osama bin Laden. There was funny incidents the other day on Twitter about this. Some nobody editor of liberation theology. Really, it's a grim communist zine called Compact. Retreading Chomskyite talking points. It's just the worst, most tired rhetoric. A man I have named Adrian Vermeulen. This is a professor of Norwood Catholic Studies at Harvard University. Adrian Vermeulen has a chai walla. You can look up what this means. He bring umbrella and chai masala tea to him. And this apparatchik tried to attack one of the Red Scare girls for liking me. And so I says to him, wait a minute, weren't you trying to pay these girls? Weren't you courting them and paying them to talk at your compact conservative so-called function because you wanted an edgy appeal or such? And now you are mad that they engage with me and talk to me because we like each other and no money is involved. And a lot of this is about, I'm sorry if some of you, whether you come from incel or anime youth faction, which, by the way, the anime Jungen I do not include in any of what I'm about to say on the show. The genuine ones, at least, are very funny, and so they are immune from criticism if they're funny. But if some of you are maybe don't see this side of things, I don't mean to convince you or for you to accept my priorities, but you have to understand that a lot of the jealous rage you're seeing directed against me, and not just now, but really since my book came out, the moment it came out, it's from these types of guys in the New York intellectual or art scenes and such, or aspiring to be in them, who are mad that the girls they pander to and they want a pat on the head from them, that they are interested in my book and not in them. And that drives, I think, a lot of the insanity against me that you are seeing the articles and such. I believe also other articles that will come out, I say. So well, finally, and then there is a third important sector of American society that's interested in my book, I hear, although not to the same extent as these other two I mentioned. But in Washington, D.C., there are among feds of various kinds, in State Department or similar and other agencies, there are small groups that like me also, from what I hear. And you can imagine how this would drive, other factions, if they should catch ear of this, it would drive them, right? Imagine seeing your own people seduced by dirty, filthy thoughts, like in this book, right? I mean, that's what would make these people panic, And then they would need, I think, a very fine hand to try to smear and attack me in various ways. But, that too would make me the target of unpleasant and jealous attention. I was hoping someone in the third world, not in Washington, D.C., but in the third world, a foreign country, maybe a small country, would find my book, That's all I need. I need one general in Botswana or whatever. Maybe not Botswana. Maybe it has to be second world. Maybe Botswana too irrelevant. I have more influence online than the president of Tanzania, if I may say. But one successful case, let's say in a mid-sized country of some significance. And from then, it's all monkey see, monkey do. That's history works. But anyway, regardless, maybe this explain, what I've told you so far, it explain the attention on me. So it's odd, I never, and this is kind of world we live in, where one internet addict shitpost book can have these effects. I'm not comparing myself in quality, let's say, to Pindar, but these things have helped me understand some lines from Pindar. I never understood some of the things he said. He's my favorite poet, maybe. He has these lines. I should tell you, on poetry, let me just make a quick tangent. This is show on erotics and love, right? The word love, however, is overused, right? You don't want to use it, or I don't. If you're at the height of passion and you want to honor a target, okay, a fixation, an obsession, an object of obsession, you don't want to say I love you because it's overused and covered up and a tired word by now. And this reminds me of Pindar because, right, the ancient bard, the Aryan or Indo-European bard, which was a kind of hereditary aristocratic position, what was their thing? In their devotionals to a god, the task was to say something old in an entirely new and striking way. And it was that newness, that was the gift to the god. That was what obligated the god. It had to be beautiful too, of course, but new and beautiful. And this led actually to a tradition of linguistic innovation, which you see carried to the extreme in Pindar. Just extreme linguistic poetic innovation. Paglia mentions the reviewer saying it just takes language to the extreme. Pindar does. And it's all to honor a god. Well, how do you honor the god of love and impress, let's say, a girl you love or something? You can't just say that word maybe. You have to innovate, say it in a new way. But that's not easy. New, again, is not random. Has to be beautiful. You have to, not be an insomniac, maybe. But anyway, Pindar always had these lines. I never understood them. The chatter of the envious, the lies of the envious. He keeps repeating this, various poems. What did it mean? Now, I see you get a little bit of fame and you do it by yourself. You're not dependent on anyone. You're not owned by anyone. And you get just the most vicious lies and vicious envy directed at you from factions of petty apparatchiks. That is the Republic of Letters for you. Having a men's warehouse prosecutor in a dry tuna salad stained blazer maybe come at you, or an equivalent other grim functionary posing as public intellectual. Very good. Enough of such bleak things. I want to move from this heavy world to think of ancient Greek symposia and parties and courtesans and love in the streets of commercial prostitute dense Corinth port. I will be right back. Let me talk for a moment about Jonah Hill, okay? And that's not a Greek name or a Greek man. I know, could he have been a clown actor in ancient Greece and be prodded with hot spikes? I doubt. He never made me laugh once. I don't understand what audience this kind of... because, he's not a jolly fat man like John Candy was. Jonah Hill has this kind of aggressive, off-putting smarm, like most of the new crop of comedians you see come out of, let's say, the Saturday Night Live type world, who are afraid to make fun of themselves. They think a comedian's job is to try to look cool and maybe superior to the audience or to some other group that they want the audience to join them in laughing at, but they never want to embarrass themselves, so they're not effective comedians. But anyway, there was stupid controversy about Jonah Hill that I wanted to ignore, but I couldn't because, what happened, for those of you who are not on social medias and such, this actor, Jonah Hill, periodically a fat man, then a thin man again, then fat, his private texts to this e-whore were leaked, in which he admonished her not to be friends with other men, not to hang out with other party girls, or to show up in bikinis on Instagram. And a number of misguided people in our broader sphere thought this was just great. A vibe change. Jonah Hill, he really taking fight to these roasties. He's putting his foot down. Jonah Hill re-establishing traditional family values, or traditional manly authority, or at least he's not taking it anymore from the matriarchy or whatever. And we should all maybe be observers, so clap like seals at this display. That's our job in this. And I hated this. I kept my mouth shut until I saw it balloon, and then I say, this is absurd. This is not traditional anything. This is not manly authority either. This is the brittle reaction of, let's say, a greengrocer clerk from 2 hours, a village 2 hours outside Ankara, some Anatolian beige peasant, chimping that his wife showed shoulder at a local women tea get-together. Please, you can't expect anyone but bleak peasants to agree to such things. And no, I do not want to live in a place where this happens. Maybe you like Mr. Tate and Islamified weirdo ex-gay porn actors like Mr. Tate who found God. Maybe you find them more to your taste, and if you like this, insisting on establishing a type of society that has never been seen among European men, really, never. A society run by, actually, in the end, women and priests is what you're asking for, because by priests I mean also the priestly type of men, which these figures I just named potentially are, in the sense of broken closet cases and freaks who find religion to wrap up their ruined sensuality in. Tucker interviewing some beige Muslim insta-whore Tate. Why? Why, Tucker, you do this? There's a big world out there, Tucker. Maybe you interview Wiratu from Burma. Interview the head monk, one of the head monks from Sri Lanka who took their nation back. Get Neil Ellis or Ibn Barlow to explain situation in Africa now, or even a chimp tyrant from Angola. I'm not even saying they have to be ideologically aligned people, but it's a big world. And Tucker has the opportunity to set up a real show like Crossfire was at its best, when Buckley, for example, interviewed Ian Smith of Rhodesia, or Kerouac, I think, and there are authors now in Europe, artists in the United States, writing all kinds of interesting things that you could have on, but where was I? This society, some want to applaud the kind of society implicit in Jonah Hill's demands, is something I can never accept. And I pointed out, in the 1950s and 60s, right, which was, for many people complaining about our tarnished morality, the 1950s and 60s was a good time compared to now. At least that's what people say. They even praise the early 90s. But many of these same people say that. So you had actresses at the time like Catherine Deneuve, and I just picked her. She's one of my favorites. She played, for example, many things, but a prostitute in Belle de Jour. Or rather, she was a housewife who gets bored. She starts to be a prostitute to break her boredom. Many other such roles. But imagine her lovers at the time chimping that she showed skin on camera, or many such things. And of course, that's just one example, really, out of centuries or even millennia of European life where such things were matter of course and would have been seen as incredibly gauche to make these kinds of demands on a woman like that who was an actress or a society-type party lady or such. And how many examples do you want? But the thing is that none of the people praising this Jonah Hill's behavior. None of them read history or books at all, from what I can tell. Sorry for tangent on pop culture-based scandal here, but actually it bears quite a bit on what I will talk on this episode. It's a long episode, by the way. But none of these people read. One of them brought up ancient Athenian men and how they sequestered their wives as a counterexample to my, well, what about actresses in the 50s and 60s and even 20s and 30s, by the way. And I was asked if I think that an ancient Greek man would have approved of their wife behaving as does this girl that Jonah Hill is trying to put the rules on. And that's actually somewhat my point. What a total misunderstanding on how many levels. First of all, this girl Jonah Hill sent these clumsy demands to is not his wife. She's a girlfriend at best, whatever that means. And it's not like he got some Kashmiri trad wife who then came to America and decided to become an Instagram thought or whatever and betrayed his expectations. He went in to the private messages of this. Essentially, she's a public e-whore and surfer and Insta influencer. And he tried to woo her and whatever they had, and then he tried to make these absurd demands on her in therapies, by the way, that demands that she become something other than she is, and that he knew that she is. And I have to tell you, that's not what ancient Greek men did, if you want to bring that up. No, they didn't set up rules with their wives on direct message in therapies. And we don't live in ancient Greece, that's my point. You can't really use that as a guide. It's an alien world to us. An ancient Greek man could beat the brains out of his wife if she did things like this, but you can't. And furthermore, it's a misunderstanding of the function of marriage socially, politically, and in one life as regard romance, because while ancient Greek men kept their wives on lockdown for political and social reasons, I will discuss later, as yes, a kind of property with a kind of political function, but in which they too, by the way, were severely constrained. But the function was the production of absolutely certain legitimate heirs and such. A political function that was consequent not on sentiment, but on breeding and on the fact that these men owned the state. They had a stake in the state as a corporation, and it was their lineage that had a stake and rights in this long-term corporation called the polis, or the city. And marriage existed as a social institution in that context, you see. But aside from this, they carried on extramarital affairs with an entirely another type of woman who they appreciated for conversation and companionship and a romantic sentiment. And these were the hetairae, or if you want, high-class prostitutes, though it's better to think of them as geishas. That's exactly what they were, actually, geishas. And I'll talk about them on this show. And geishas, entirely different rules apply to them. If you want to bring up ancient Greece, or for that matter, entirely patriarchal warrior culture, medieval Japan, right, geishas. They didn't chimp and would have seen as absurd beyond words to complain that your geisha continued to talk to other men or to carry on public functions and parties, or that she showed shoulder in the agora or something like this. Absurd. And I mentioned Aspasia, right? This was Pericles' concubine. In fact, he left his wife for her, which was unusual, but I may talk this later too, because she seems to have been actually a philosopher of some note, or at least a rhetorician. She was an orator who taught many great men of the time the art of rhetoric. And so if you want to bring up ancient Greece, which you should not because it's something else entirely, but then be aware that this arrangement of the geisha was also traditional and operated under entirely different rules, much more similar to what goes on today in the, let's say, sexual chaos we have. I don't want to say it's the same, but it's more similar to that. Men still ruled and so on, and more importantly, passion, real passion ruled, unlike today. But in this world of romance and love of their time, it was still a war, and the rules were not as set as for wives, not even close. So if you don't know this today because you don't have wives today, you don't have real marriage, so the matter is confused entirely. You think these two things are the same or can be mixed, but in my opinion, they cannot. You can't base marriage on sentiment or romance. The reason you don't have marriages that are real, because if they're based on the woman's whims, for example, as marriages are today, the contract actually means nothing at all. But it's because men nowhere own their territory. They don't have their own territory. I think there's not a nation in the world, almost. I can't actually think of one. And marriage ultimately only makes sense when men own their territory. Otherwise, subjects and slaves, right, who cares, right? It's not a prescription I'm making. I think it's a reality I described, that marriage, what is it for, okay? You never stop to think about that. And the fact that you are slaves or equivalent, that you have this inheritance of this bastardized institution of marriage that sort of nobody knows anymore what it's really for. I don't mean, there are those of you who are religious or whatever reasons you have for it, but socially and politically it's a weird vestigial inheritance. So this leads to the kind of confused replies I got about Jonah Hill's girlfriend of all people. And him of all people, who is, an actor too, by the way. Let's not forget that side of things. Yeah, Jonah Hill re-establishing traditional morality, and we should all clap. I remember, it's a very telling image. Sorry if I repeat it. I remember talking to some 20-year-old gay guy in Brazil. I don't know the exact year. I think must have been late 2000s. So quite recent. And this was an openly gay. And what stuck with me is how absurd he found the law, which I think was proposed and passed around that time in Brazil, that men cannot beat their wives. Now, mind you, again, I emphasize this is not a 70-year-old ex-military from military dictatorship era. He's not a priest. He's not an old taxi driver even. He was, at the time, Zoomer, 20 whatever, gay, and he, as most Brazilians also, this law, I think, was imposed on them by their Marxified elite and so on. They found this just absurd, risible. How could you forbid a husband from beating his wife? Okay, think how odd that is. Now, you may not need to beat them, and I wouldn't recommend that, but if they know you will not, that changes things a lot in marriage, okay? If they know that you cannot, you don't have, in part for that reason, but for many others too, you don't have real marriages now. So don't bring up ancient Greece to me. In ancient Greek, Aristoman had concubines who were party girls and geishas, and they all went in love and war, so-called, in that world, more or less. There was, as I tell you, a similar kind of romantic warfare, intra-sex rivalry as there is now. And I'm not even bringing up the other side of it, which was, homosexual love, which I might cover on future episodes. In fact, I think I should. I don't know. Should I imagine the distortions in our climate if I were to discuss the nature of that in ancient Greece? But I might have to, because I see now so many lies spread about this from all sides, by the way, including people who want to deny that it was a major part of Greek life and so on. Not to speak of the distortions from the gay side. But anyway, what I will tell you now about hetairai, courtesans, geishas in ancient Greece, geishas, also a patriarchal warrior Aristo-Japan, went on throughout European history also, during its long Christian history, yes, in the Middle Ages and after. As I may have mentioned, there is even a Catholic text, De Concubinatu, on concubines, which even the church was forced to recognize this institution. You look at the romantic and social life of the French aristocracy, and of the French king himself. Louis XV had at least two famous mistresses, Madame de Pompadour and Madame du Barry. And Louis XIV, the height of French monarchy, right, at its most vital period, he also had mistresses who became more famous and glamorous than his wife. And in the case of some of them, like du Barry, she was a prostitute, or started out that way. She had numerous lovers at French court prior to the king, all prominent men. Similar, you may look up Ninon de L'Enclos, same thing in the 1600s, a courtesan, muse, patron of the arts, and a writer herself, a courtesan mistress to many famous men of the time, including Rochefoucauld, one of my favorite philosophers. I will do show on him later too. A man so highly praised by Nietzsche and Schopenhauer and other good men. But besides him, many politicians and such of the time she had as lovers, or Nell Gwyn, same thing, Charles II's mistress, and similar type artsy courtesan and such. Very much an ancient Greek thing, and they all wanted to be with this geisha. Do you think they fretted about her body count, or whether she showed shoulder at parties, or that Trump did with his supermodel wives, or whether she continued partying or talked to other men? It would have been seen as height of absurdity. But on the side, they all had certain and socially sanctioned marriages, locked down, if they wanted. That is true, and you don't. I understand that, but you can't mix these things or change the rules of one, and it's unnecessary, and I would not call it barbaric even, but it's a kind of foreign peasant. The foreign typical peasant is an incel, and it's a kind of foreign peasant inceling position to insist that the entire heritage of Western man that I'm in part describing to you now, and the history of romance in the West, be condemned or cancelled so that you can import the mores of a dreadful Middle Eastern, wrapped in robes, smelling of urine and banging their barbaric religious books full of stupidities. You don't have real marriages now because you don't own territory, I repeat to you. But you cannot counter then the law of the jungle with this impotent complaining about women being sluts and so on. Actually, as you can see, Aristomen with a lot of power have some history throughout the world of loving glamorous sluts. And I'm sorry if that offends you, but maybe yes, you read some about history about what so-called trad life was actually like. On the other hand, is this a prescription? No. Do I say then you must man up and marry sluts? No, again, that makes a mockery of marriage. The whole feminist and social conservative alliance to blame social dysfunction on men playing video games and to try to shame them into marrying sluts or obese or other such or aged roasties. That too, but is a misunderstanding of marriage and a mixing up of things that shouldn't get mixed up. My point here is there are no real marriages today, which is why these two very different things get confused. So anyway, this is not personal advice show, nor am I interested in giving people life advice in general, but regarding marrying a slut, I know several men who married girls who were not sluts and who gave very strong signals, maybe not that they were right-wing, but they would, oh, I'm not a slut, I'm not a slut. They still ended up being in terrible marriages, ended up in divorce and such. Or else they are men trapped in hellish lives now with mentally ill wives. And it's a bad deal all around, you see. And I don't pretend to give people, again, personal life advice. If you're taking such advice from Bronze Age pervert, maybe reassess your position. It's funny when I brought up this Aristo tradition of mistresses and love with geishas and such, I got some other self-righteous replies, including, well, Hitler, you see, Hitler, he really took it to those decadent aristocrats who swap wives. But they did not swap wives, as I tell you. That's the point. They had real marriages, and then there was this other world to the side of it. But yes, some people replied, he really took it to them. He took it to those decadent aristocrats, and he established folkish family values or whatever. It's nonsense. You don't have to like Hitler or to have an opinion one way or another on his crimes to see that actually here precisely there's very interesting illustration of a major difference between the traditional right and the progressive or radical right. In fact, it was the other way around from what I just said. Hitler was attacked by the true cons, the true conservatives of his time who were saying, he's not a real conservative. He was attacked by the Junkers, the aristocratic reactionaries, and the stodgy religious types for being a degenerate, right? Degenerate, right? This word that keeps getting passed around on dissident circles now, degenerate urbanite and such. There's a whole book somewhat documenting this, by the way, in an incompetent way, but it's a funny book called The Pink Swastika. But it actually doesn't go deep enough into what precisely the reactionary aristos and conservatives of the time were saying about Hitler. He's not a true conservative and such. Sound familiar? Even in actually William Shirer's slanderous book on the Third Reich, he engages in some of the same cheap shot thing. Oh, they were perverts, the degenerate, immoral, and sexually loose background of Hitler's circle and the Nazis. He does that a little bit, but the reactionaries of the time were doing that big time. And no, it wasn't just Ernst Röhm, by the way. Not that Ernst Röhm was unique in his particular predilections among the Nazis. And he was often thrown into Hitler's face by conservatives of the time during his rise, and Hitler's answer was, the SA is not an organization for little girls. But it isn't just him. I mean to say this movement was full of lechers and libertines and crazy mystics, outright schizophrenics, people who Göring liberated from mental asylum the day that Nazis took power. And in most cases of these, by the way, like Willigut, if you look him up, they were not political prisoners under the pretext of insanity. He was actually outright schizophrenic. But many libertines too, and this constantly got thrown in the Nazis' faces. They were not, Nazis were not social conservatives. Sorry to tell some of you. There is a speech by Goebbels. A friend will republish it soon. It's a very funny speech. He outright attacks social conservatives in this speech. He attacks traditionalists. He states very clearly the National Socialist movement is not a traditionalist movement. The occasion for the speech was in part some trad reactionary who had only recently joined the Nazi party, but he was the governor or mayor of some area. He banned an advertising that showed skin. It was for some soap advertisement. under the pretext that, it's not according to Nazi law. And Goebbels goes off on him for this. He outright says, this is not a pietistic state. This is a state that celebrates life. Their social policy in general, not just the Lebensborn program, which of course conservative could never accept, but their social program in general, even for day-to-day people, day-to-day women, would never have been acceptable to traditional conservatives now, or even at the time. Most Catholic conservatives voted against them overwhelmingly, by the way, and opposed them. So they had not actually a feminist program on such things, but yes, much closer to that, if you want to make the case. They had an entirely modern program on sexuality, family life, and so on, and not a conservative one. And they thought, as Goebbels says in this speech, that the traditionalist position was outdated, stupid, and embarrassing in a modern state. The Strength Through Joy, if you look up the Strength Through Joy program, that imagery, the whole feeling behind that program, which is, let's say, the most innocent and innocuous part of that regime that actually survived after the war in various forms, even in liberal countries. But that's not a conservative imagery. You are mixing things up. Their imagery looked much more like Handsome Thursday, okay, which is why it was effective and the conservatives were not. And that's partly why I went on this rant. And I mean to tell you, to make the connection to Trump as well. Trump was attacked for pretty much the same reasons. Not that he's a Nazi, but this division on the right holds regardless, again, of the morality of the people holding it on both sides. The same people who are now self-righteously invoking Pharisaic religion to pretend to be the champions of the dissident right were in 2016 and so on attacking Trump for being a degenerate New York values, urbanite cuck degenerate or whatever Cruz that these bleak propagandists were saying. They're saying the same thing now, whether it's under the DeSantis banner or the Kanye scam or many other such things. Do you think Trump, by the way, told, I ask you again, his supermodel wives and girlfriends that they could not go around showing skin or talking to other men and such or hashing out rules? Yes, baby, let's work out the rules before. Here are my rules. How pathetic. Once you do that, you've already lost, by the way. Just because feminists and their allies often use the insecure man trope doesn't mean it's wrong in every case, by the way. If a retard like Jonah Hill, who you know his weight fluctuations, right? And I don't remember if it was the poster Carlton Autism or John Winthrop who used it. Became a meme, internet thing, a meme on the internet, right? Jonah Hill's weight changes. Every time he became thin again, Carlton would have a photo of him saying, yeah, I'm thinking he's back. And everyone found it funny. And now, this weird, unstable, narcissistic striver actor, we're all supposed to sit there and applaud as, yes, this is what a real man does. He put his foot down. If you can't admit that he's an insecure freak, to ask an insta-thought he pursued to stop showing bikini photos, then when does that argument ever apply, if not on this? Don't confuse. Look, if you read classic Hartiste, by the way, Chateau Hartiste, I bring him up sometimes. It's one of the original pickup artists, so-called commentators or manosphere. By the way, why these articles say I'm manosphere or masculinity, anyone who's read my book or listens to this show knows I have nothing to do with that, but they try to pigeonhole me in this. I like Hartiste, but I don't come out of the same world he does. And I appreciate Hartiste, by the way, not for his game advice and so on, but for his views on female nature and resurrecting in popular language the ideas of Schopenhauer on women, which really are just pre-evolutionary biology ideas type. But you can't be like this, where you reflexively take the side of any man. That's stupid. I mean, in Hartiste comments, when people would occasionally show up to complain about girls or ask advice, and he would say sometimes, no, this girl did nothing wrong. You're a retard, you're acting like a loser, and she can smell it on you. I refuse to, holding whom solidarity actually discredits you, okay? And credit in telling the truth is all we have. And I will not join shit-skinned peasants or those who of like kidney to an Anatolian calculating shopkeeper in condemning these things that have always been part of Western life and that would take, actually, if you take them to their logical conclusion, would take all the pleasure out of life. And that furthermore, as I keep saying, because this is why I went on the rant both online and I'm doing it here, some of people on the right, let's say the well-intentioned ones, but in their zeal on the woman question on one hand and in their obsession with personal life advice on the other, are engaging in this kind of discourse that is highly ineffective. It's actually embarrassing. And when you try to engage in the conservative intellectual stock trade for decades now, the sentimentality about family values and this kind of foot stomping regarding traditionalism, which has been completely useless, right? Or things wouldn't have gotten to where they are now. It's totally useless messaging. It comes pre-caricatured quite successfully, so you end up looking stupid when you do it. And it's worse because it opens the door for very bad types. It opens the door to closet cases who use religion to try, you've seen these weird types, right? The bow tie conservative and similar other kind. I would count the Tate-adjacent people as a kind of repressed gay who frets a lot about whether young men, they like this phrase, young men, should they masturbate and how much and the details of their sex lives, and they want to regulate that, right? And they want to call blowjobs mouth sodomy. And really a lot of their output, it's, let's say, based on the idea that a Chad fucking hot girls is just as bad, it's just as bad as a degenerate sodomite. Right, now think about why they would be concerned with proving that. And on the other hand, it's ex-sluts who, found God and now seek to use that to engage in overt right-wing language because they know there are suckers who will fall for this. So, I took it up the ass in marathon sessions with lacrosse players and I sucked 4 cocks at that party, but now I found God and Christ first, and with you, of course, I will not do any of that because you're my husband in Christ, or whatever they say, and suckers just eat that up. And that kind of female, plus also then the ugly old women who are the main demographic of this, who want to keep a sexual cartel, they also gain entry when you base messaging, around things like this. And many other worse kinds of people too, which is something philosophers like Schopenhauer have long noted. If you read his thoughts on polygamy and prostitution, it's long been known that the prime accusers of women are other women who see, especially on this subject, they see the free offer or the cheap offer of sex as lessening the value of the only thing they think they can offer as a group. It lessens their bargaining power, which is why I think it was women very often who would stone or kill sluts and famous prosties in history and such whenever they could, you see. Women. And that's who you're letting in when you try to recenter messaging on condemning sluts and such. Again, I do not count in this, what I'm saying now, the very few central figures of the anime Jugend or anime youth account who in their extreme brutal misogyny, they are so funny that they cannot be counted among this. But aside from that, when it's not funny, when it's genuinely driven by this kind of rage, I find it to be, let's have a daily condemnation of sluts, right? You don't realize the idiocy you invite with this. And worst of all, and what really prompted my tirade on this, is the intrusion of brown or beige, resentful, incel-adjacent retards who want to rail against, especially white women for being sluts but not sleeping with them. So a very common thing. It's made much worse by TikTok, by online culture. And so, no, it is not a win for us, gentlemen. It's not a win when you applaud like an idiot seeing wiggerized types with sideways visor on social media panels, whatever that means, they are on these video social media panels, denouncing some OnlyFans whore sitting next to them. No, you traducing and you discombobulating love, and this, and then we sit by and applaud. Yes, this vibe change, that's a real win. That's our idea spreading. Fuck off, retards. This is embarrassing. What do the social relations of chandalas matter to you anyway? Besides the fact that they're using this fake outrage to popularize each other, or maybe you don't know how this works. Oh yes, they invite OnlyFans girls, they act like moronic baboons on camera in this performance of rage, and then the OnlyFans girl gives them a cut in the next subscriptions that he drives up for them, or something like this. You do not know that is how this goes. And even if it doesn't go so explicitly in calculated, explicit way, that's exactly what they're doing still. It's a form of raising their social media profile. That's why it was so stupid of many of you, for example, to promote Tommy Lahren when she was engaging in these spats with streaming spats with these rappers, going back and forth, insulting each other. Are you stupid? That is a mud shark, you mamsers. Normal white girls don't get into back and forth slap fights like that with rappers. They ignore them. They live in another world completely. Tommy Lahren is fucking them, and then they do this show on camera for social media outrage clouds, or she fucks them after anyway. I don't know Is this what you'd like, this moronic applause for social media porn people, essentially? I repeat to you, this messaging, even if it were sincere, is entirely a lost cause. You can't win by outrage over women's loose sexuality and such. If that's your concern, that may or may not be valid, but you have to outflank that somehow. Because when you engage in it in this earnest way, you are inhabiting the frame already well set by libtards and the left. And my remembering of how things were, let's say, 2010 to 2015, because by the time Trump came in, we were already being flooded with imbeciles, and many of the original frogs were getting banned. I was banned several times. But since then, there are more eyes on me now. Since there are more eyes on me right now, because of the recent attention with articles and so on, and since this is in the free and public part of this episode, it bears repeating what I'm about to repeat now. My remembering of what the right, or let's say not even the right, but really the people who stood up against establishment stuffed shirts and orthodoxies around that time, starting actually a little bit before 2010, but up to 2015-16. When I remember this, it's not for nostalgia, but to tell you what was effective, what for the first time really in decades brought international attention to this. Because before that, and I've been on the right forever, you can say, and on the online hard right, if you want to call it so, or at least engaged with it since at least about 2007, 2008. I know it back and forth much better than you. I remember how useless it was. What gets called white nationalism 1.0, for example, David Duke or Rockwell, well before that, or many other similar types, entirely useless. All they ever got was laundering identities of those they lured to their stupid rallies. They laundered it and sold it to the SPLC. They sold this to the FBI or similar. And quite aside from this scam, the message just was entirely useless and hopeless. And it paralleled actually the hopeless message of the conservative mainstream, who similarly for decades the conservative mainstream promoted the same useless message, the platitudes, cross-flag family routine, while getting blasted out by the left because it just lacks energy and truth, you see. It lacks truth because we live in the kingdom of darkness. There are no institutions left to defend. A good posture can only be had based on hard truth, without illusions. There is no social order or moral order left. We are fighting already in the kingdom of darkness to win the youth to an exhilarating vision of the future. And in this moral Pharisaism, moral hysteria, braggartry, cannot do that. It opens the door to embarrassing imbeciles. That's my point in all this, embarrassing imbeciles. You cannot win that way. I can tell you not one of the frogs who was effective and who made the world say, wait, here's something new and interesting. Wait, here are people saying things that no one else says and no one else can say. And not one of us like this. We all instead come out of degenerate forums or 4chan or similar. Not one came out of normie, conservative or traditionalist world. None of us came out this schoolmarm moralism frame. And precisely zero of the international attention we have brought to the right has anything to do with a Chandala mystery meat finding religion, so-called, and engaging in Pharisaic moral posturing on camera. Trump did not come out of that either. We used humor. We appealed to common sense, to nature, to science, yes, scientific studies to make our argument, not mysticism, not obfuscation, not religion, and especially not moralism, which never works. Even when some of us, like Loki, for example, I don't think I'm being indiscreet, he's in complete agreement with me on this, but he's a very pious, I think, radical Protestant of some kind, I don't know. But there are many either like this, like Thomas Seven, or there are pious Catholics, but they understood what works and what doesn't, and that the world we live is already a world of sin and darkness, and you have to accept that if you hope to win. But it's humor and good cheer above all, and the humorlessness of these other people I'm attacking is ultimately, it's what drives potential converts to, you see, we need converts. Humorlessness drives them away. This is what I mean. We need many converts, and we need them in the highest reaches of society, because we can't really hope to persuade large masses of normies, and that's useless, as you've seen anyway. We need to seduce and persuade, let's say, certain sectors of institutions in society, and we're very far from having any power. I'd say there are at best 50,000 of us worldwide. Don't confuse the faction of truth, as I like to call it sometimes, but don't confuse us for, say, populist parties in Europe like Vox or AFD or such, which are very much a mixed bag. We don't have actually the numbers to run. If you were to gather all of us in the world, we do not have the numbers to run even in a parliamentary proportional system in a small European country, I think. But we do have the numbers to do this other thing. But anyway, who will listen to me? I am just pervert with a radio show. But the humorlessness and imbecile nature of these moralisms lately is what got me, why I went on such tirade about Jonah Hill and his prosty girlfriend and such anyway. But it is related to what I will talk about on this show next regarding ancient Greek social life and such. So anyway, in closing, here is Nietzsche on similar types in his time, how ready they themselves basically are to make people atone, how they thirst to be hangmen. Among them, there are plenty of people disguised as judges seeking revenge. They always have the word justice in their mouths like poisonous saliva, with their mouths always pursed, always ready to spit at anything which does not look discontented and goes on its way in good spirits. Among them, there is no lack of that most disgusting species of vain people, the lying monsters who aim to present themselves as beautiful souls, and who, for example, carry off to market their ruined sensuality, wrapped up in verse and other swaddling clothes as purity of heart, the species of self-gratifying moral masturbators. Yes, moralistic gibberish, a path to suicide for the right, or the faction of truth, call it what you want, moderate centrist. Thank you, I will be right back. Yes, thank you, Mr. Shapiro. Thank you to Ben Shapiro, the Talmudic Network, send regards and thanks. And many other network also sends you thanks. You are doing quite well. Ever since little Ben Shapiro called out my book on his show, maybe 2 or 3 days ago, after this article came out, my book is back in top ranks of Amazon. I think it got up to rank 1,000, and it's been in the top 2,000 consistently recent. I think you should realize that very high rank, especially for, again, self-published book more than 5 years ago now. So my disciple, Ben Shapiro, doing quite well, following orders well, and with Ben Shapiro, you win. Thank you so much. Thank you. The Talmudic Network thanks you. Where were we? Welcome back to show. I should say, since this is such a high emotional subject, when you talk women, love affairs, the relationship maybe of ancient thing to a modern thing regarding sexual matters that are very touchy, I need to re-emphasize this not show of practical advice. What you should do one way or another in your life. In other words, I don't mean, for example, if you are in an unfortunate situation where you are 18 or 19 and you have, let's say, a girlfriend or whatever it's called now, and she's making you uncomfortable perhaps by talking to another man. I don't mean, therefore, that you should tolerate that because Madame Pompadour or something ridiculous like this, any more than the opposite, that you should imagine yourself an ancient Greek patriarch who has any power whatsoever under the law or social custom to put her in her place. What I could tell you very generally is that engaging in therapies and setting out rules is both unromantic and clumsy and ultimately ineffective. For sure, something like what's his name? Jonah Hill, is that it? Something like what he engaged in never works. It is something that happens usually at the end of affairs. That being said, I am afraid that conservatives are responsible for the sorry state of things now, because in decades they have stood by and spoken about morality and many other such high virtue things in the abstract, and they've never done anything about what actually could change things fundamentally and what is the cause of all today's problems, which is the disenfranchisement of young men in particular from having any stake in society one way or another. They will not touch this subject. Many of them are women men, let's put it this way. They are cowards. They are under a thumb of their wives or women in general. They will not touch this subject, without which nothing really good can come about. Even if you are going to give, let's say, a normie conservative everything they wanted in terms of moral reform and such, the most you'd have is a stolid nursing home society. Without giving younger men some share of the power in society, without this natural order of having strength and dynamism rule, all you will get is, you will not have any innovation, you will not have any energy, much like Mr. Luttwak kindly said in this article in Politico, under the questioning of the libtard journalist. He stood his ground and said some unusual things in this article. I strongly recommend you read his statement there. But no, this is not show about personal advice. I do not claim to give you that. I am against the giving of general personal advice to any kind of general audience, even a small one such as this show has. And because you need to know the person, you need to know what they want, you need to know their character, their history, their particular circumstances, and so on. Actually, this case that I just mentioned now, when, let's say, if you have a girlfriend and she talked to another man, you don't like that, and let's say you don't like that for good reason, that you're not just being paranoid or imagining things or being exceedingly jealous. That is very sensitive thing to deal with. It's a very complicated situation that requires much finesse, unless you simply want to leave the woman. But how to solve that problem with a woman in any age is, again, unless she's your wife and you are in ancient Greece or in Saudi Arabia, then it's a simple solution. But as things stand in most societies, if it is a matter of free romance and free love, if even in ancient Greece, if that was not your wife, if it was your hetaira doing that, how you handle that in matter of sexual warfare and romance warfare is very, very complicated matter that highly depends on the circumstance, how you handle it. So this, what I say, just maybe general advice could be from what I'm about to say in the next two segments. You will notice, in fact, the book I will quote, that ancient Greek men did not care very much about these matters. They did not determine the happiness of their life or the point of their life by their romantic affairs with a geisha or with their wife. It simply was not that important to them. They didn't care. And by the way, not that this is the reason you should do it, but it is said that women strong respond to indifferent men if it's sincerely held indifference. Because of why? I think they have good instincts for this. I mentioned it in my book. The men I'm talking about in ancient Greece had higher purposes. And you should dedicate yourself to these higher purposes, the cleansing of the world. And maybe that kind of indifference, there is no, to be vulgar, piece of pussy that's worth caring about all that much. Maybe this is only general advice that could be given. Although I am told, again, that many sensitive young men, I'm not sure if this is what this phrase means, but that they have a pining desire for young love. They want something very much like Mishima book, the Mishima book Sound of Waves or Spring Snow or something along these lines. And I much understand these impulses, but again, on that I have nothing to say, at least in this episode. And it's a history episode. Whatever is applicable to modern life is applicable only indirectly. So anyway, ancient Greek marriage had this reasoning, the preservation of the founding lines of the city, the lineages of the citizens, or if you want me to be stark about it, think of it like corporate stakeholders. It was much more than that, of course, but the point is it was also that. In other words, they owned the city. So they had regulations to arrange marriages entirely for these purposes I just said. It was a one-sided thing. The man was not expected to have really any devotion besides this political and utilitarian one to the wife. not to speak of any emotional involvement. It was not a matter of romance or idealism at all, actually. Marriages were arranged. Later on, when Greeks encountered non-arranged marriages, the reaction was, well, of course they're going to fail because the man and the woman will no doubt become tired of each other after a while if you base it on love. It's just common sense. And the other aspect of the marriage was the production of strong children with emphasis on biological quality, yes, or eugenics, which was very explicitly endorsed as early as Homer, but very much so in the works of Pindar and Theognis, aristocratic poets, of whom Theognis especially, he's upset that mixed marriages are taking place, by which he means men are marrying for money rather than biological quality, and he has this great line, do not be surprised that your town is becoming an obscure place. It's no longer famous or glamorous because race is being confounded by money. So, he had very much awareness, actually, philosophers throughout history have, that caste is race, but that's another subject maybe. But this element appeared everywhere in Greek world. In Sparta, a king was fined by the ephors because he picked a rich but ugly wife instead of a poor but beautiful one of good race. And the ephors said, this guy is giving us kinglets, not kings, so we are going to fine him. Can you think of another state that would do things like that for that reason? And so much emphasis was placed on blood, only secondarily so in education, although, of course, from ancient times, it was recognized many heroes had received training from demigods like the centaur Chiron and others, Achilles and many others did. But this was very much, as I say, recognized as at most a sharpening of innate talents, which is why Theognis is, and he's not alone in saying, never will you make a bad man good by teaching him something. It was called kalokagatia. It was the shorthand for the aristocracy, meaning kaloi kai agatoi, the beautiful and the good. And good in this sense doesn't mean agathos, doesn't refer to moral goodness, in the same way that kalos doesn't just refer to moral nobility. It means literally beautiful, magnificent, powerful, and same agathos refers to the qualities of a great warrior, terrible warlord and such. It was basically society set up as a training and competition camp. This is why maybe they had a fording of not really caring so much about what women thought, which, again, women find very sexy. I'm sure that the women of neighboring tribes and nations found Greek men sexier than their own house husbands, let's say. But especially in the age following Homer, at times called the Archaic Age or the Agonal Age, which almost all readers of ancient Greece recognize as its most magnificent, strongest, most vital period. I am using for this show, by the way, at times Plutarch, especially his life of Pericles, where he also talks about Aspasia, his courtesan mistress, and some other interesting things. But most of all, I'm using Burckhardt's famous book on the Greeks and Greek civilization, where he refers in the beginning to the sacred marriage that was perceived taking place in 19th century between German culture and ancient Hellenism. But anyway, he remarks on the fact, not discussed on this episode, but maybe probably on future one, that when you have a competitive society set up like this, around the agon, the competition, the formalized duel, as a series again of stylized duels between men, and with much of this centered around physical and athletic competition, which leads to inevitably physical beauty that was appreciated as the insurance of creation of beautiful citizens and power for the future of the city. But when you have that focus on beauty in this way, there are homoerotic or homosexual love, according to Burckhardt, is almost inevitable for a number of reasons. And yes, this was a central feature of aristocratic Greek life from especially around this period, the Archaic or Agonal Age onward. Although it continued through the Classical Age, it mostly ended by Hellenistic period after Alexander. It never completely ended, but it lost, let's say, its cultural, religious, kind of idealistic foundation, educational foundations, and so on. I will cover this in detail on future episode, maybe next time, I think. But I will say quickly, there is much misdirection on all sides on this matter for all kinds of reasons. And very quickly, the image of pederasty you might have of, let's say, a 40-year-old, 40-something-year-old man fucking an 80-year-old boy up the ass and things like that. That's not how it worked. It was instead, as Burckhardt hints in the passage, I'll read another time, it was mostly, again, a side effect of the very competitive culture of the gymnasia, and you might have a 22 or 24-year-old with a 17 or 16-year-old at that part of their lives only, and they did not practice the same types of acts modern homosexuals did, and with heavily, let's say, a war-based or education for war-based element in it, which actually they shared with various other Aryan societies. But again, I will discuss this later, and I will surely be completely swamped by chimp-out attacks and distortions. But the reason I mention it now is that as this relationship I just named intensified in importance in Greek aristocratic life, the interest in, romantic and emotional investment in marriage, although not in women, to which I will get to in a moment, because extramarital relations with women also became more important through another channel, but the focus of life in marriage became even less, and it led also to jeering views of women, and so it's regarding marriage, the utilitarian, social, economic, and political aspects tended then to completely predominate. So much so that to illustrate this, Burckhardt has a very revealing anecdote I will read for you. That marriage was nothing but a convenient legal arrangement without the slightest emotional content is shown, for example, by Diogenes Laertius. He gives a citation. The philosopher Menedemus and his old friend Asclepiades married a mother and a daughter. When the daughter died, Asclepiades married the mother handed over to him by Menedemus, who himself, now the ruler of the state, took a wealthy wife. But as he continued to live with Asclepiades, still entrusted the management of the household to his first wife. And all this was about the year 300 or later. Diodorus protests against young people marrying for love. He is certainly repeating an argument from the time of the Diadochoi. These are the Hellenistic rulers, the generals who followed Alexander and split up his empire between themselves and became local emperors. So you had the Seleucids, the Ptolemies, and so forth. When the Indian custom of sati became known, the widow in high caste marriages burning herself on her husband's funeral pyre, the Greeks of the later period deduced that these must have been very many troubled marriages which frequently led to poisonings, and that the marriages had come to grief because they were not arranged by the parents but agreed on by the couples themselves, so that they were bound to fail when they repented of their choice. Yes, do you like this? But that one line about the household of the philosopher Menedemus, who later became leader of his state, the line about his friend and their marriages, it's so odd. It almost reads like modern polycule arrangement, except for fact that, again, it's only a superficial resemblance, in this case consequent not upon a Reddit liberalism and disgusting ethical polyamory or such, but on the entirely political and legal character that marriage ended up having, and the fact that the wife was really just a possession, a vessel to transmit the man's blood lineage and such. So much so that, Burckhardt points out, in the various myths, the famous myth, but various myths leading, for example, having to do with adultery, but there is one famous one you may all know of, where Hephaestus captures Ares and his wife, Hephaestus' wife Aphrodite, captures them in the midst of adulterous copulation. And the other gods are invited to watch. He captures them with a net, they watch, and they laugh at Ares as they would laugh at the thief that is caught, but they don't laugh at Hephaestus. And similarly, if you read court cases, there is no shame really attached to the cuckolded husband who is perceived as wronged in the same way someone is wronged by a theft of property. And the direst consequences and punishments, of course, come upon adultery and adulterous women, including, by the way, the right of the husband to kill his wife and her lover, especially if he found them in the act, where then it could be said that he acted by passion, whereas if it was found instead that he deliberated or calculated their murder, then it was illegal to kill them. Then it was murder, it was not a legal killing. But there is a famous court case by Lysias on this. I think I mentioned it before. But yes, wives were seen in an entirely rational way as possessions of husbands for political purposes of continuing citizen lineages with full guarantee of paternity and legitimacy. As Burckhardt says, emotion didn't much enter into it at all. Conservatives are fond especially of a dialogue, the Economicus of Xenophon. This is a student of Socrates who wrote this dialogue about the education that, let's say, a virtuous, well-to-do farmer gives his wife. And actually, it's one of the few tender depictions of relations between husband and wife in Greek literature, which is why Again, modern conservatives love this book. Bruce Thornton bases a lot of his analysis of ancient Greek love on this book. He's wrong, because I'm about to tell you this depicts affair, again, not generally between a man and a woman, but specifically between a husband and wife. It's an exception, is what I'm saying. It's almost unique as a tender and nice description. So it's a bit misleading to use as illustrative example of what the rule was. It was certainly not this. Marriage was, let's put it this way. I will read from Burckhardt so you get a view. Denunciations which result in the man's death play an important part here. He's talking about the literature of the classical and late agonal age and actually quite ancient Greek myths that depict women as murderesses and betrayers of their cities for the cause of lust, fuck-crazy, maniac, sex-crazed freaks, in other words. That was the Greek view of women. I continue reading. It could be said that just as in the Middle Ages the rule was a romantic idealization of the female as an angel, here in ancient Greece it is a romantically ruthless image of implacability. And where these legends and foundation myths left off, tragedy later continued in the same vein. While poetry and legend mainly gave this somber picture of the female personality, the Greek attitude toward women varied from one place to another. Their status was lowest in Ionia, where Lydian influence was perhaps the explanation for the restriction on their lives, and in Athens. Here women were confined to the house and their education was limited to what was necessary for domestic matters. This must have been the result of the exceptional development of the polis, the city, which privileged public affairs. Other communities had other attitudes. The Peloponnese presents a varied picture. In Corinth, which is, with its extensive prostitution, women were little respected. While in Lacedaemon, where Spartan women had to look after the farms, their status was of course higher. There the girls were actually brought up on to the agon, the competition, the culture of competition, and they were allowed to compete in sports, probably not with the sole aim of ensuring their fitness to bear children. Similarly in Elis, on the banks of the Alpheus, perhaps in Arcadia, a beauty contest was held for women at the celebrations of the Eleusinian Demeter, and the contestants were given the title of gold bearers. There were also competitions in the moral virtues and in housekeeping skills. Aeolian communities come out particularly well in their attitude to women. There is an epitaph of Simonides of Chios on a powerful huntress of Boeotian Thessaly called Lycas, whose bones still make the wild beasts tremble. Such a model could not have existed in Ionia, but might still be accepted in Boeotia. In Aeolian communities, there are women poets as well as men. At the end of the 6th or beginning of the 5th century, the young Pindar encountered Myrtis and Corinna as his rivals at the public agon, the competition for poetry, and was once beaten to the prize by Corinna. Lesbos, 100 years earlier, was the home of the lyric poet Sappho and her friends Damophila and Erina, among whom, even if they composed no choral odes, some rivalry must have naturally arisen, not very different from the relationship in the musical agon. Beauty contests were also held on Lesbos and Tenedos. Wherever women were oppressed, the hetairai, the courtesans, predictably gained in importance, who I will talk about now in a moment, but let me take a break first. Yes, I'm back. But before I talk geishas, I should say Burckhardt is totally right on this matter of marriage, of its secondary importance in the life of a Greek man. He is supported in this by many other classicists, including Nietzsche, who casually remarks, really the only education and entertainment allowed to women, citizen women that is, was religion, the occasional religious festival. And they're not especially keen on celebrating this, by the way. Burckhardt, it's not like, I'm telling you, it's not like Nietzsche and Burckhardt and similar others who remark on this. It's not like they're rubbing their hands saying this is a good thing. Burckhardt refers to really cruel, loathsome courtship customs and marriage practices, such as men abandoning brides if their father died and they could not bring a big dowry, or callously leaving their wives for richer wives, and many such things. And in general, the more sensitive Greeks like Sophocles and others recognized the sorry plight of women, felt bad, pitied them, I think, and much like in China now, there was, because of this widespread practice of exposure of female infants and such, both among poor families and rich, the moment of tenderness, I tell you again, in Xenophon's Economicus, that conservatives like to focus on to pretend that the Greeks were family values types. Again, that is rather unique, and far more frequent are scenes like in Phaedo, Plato, where Socrates dismisses his crying wife and other women with really a kind of callousness and a disrespect that would never happen in, let's say, later European times. And instead, Socrates shows great affection, friendship for Phaedo only, ruffles his hair and such, but his wife is dismissed, and, this is because Socrates is about to be executed, right? He's about to die, and his wife is, and he just, get her out of here, I can't, but so much for marriage then. Let's get to what really interested men of the time in terms of romance, which, okay, leaving aside the very contentious and complicated matter of homosexual love, which mostly they would have done something like that in their youth, they were in fact very much into courtesans, harlots, and hetairae, or geishas. Hetaira is a Greek word for like a female companion. The hetairoi were Alexander's personal guard, his cavalry guard, the companions and so forth. But hetaira means female companion, euphemism for courtesan, or again, think geishas, who they were resented by citizen wives for this very reason, that they were really the romantic and sentimental focus of their men. Probably such things as geishas exist in many societies that have sex segregation plus cultivation toward fine things in life. I would guess that's what happens because men end up finding the so-called acceptable women in such societies to be very dull. But then they end up having very refined tastes, and they need this other kind of companionship. And so, in places, again, where there's sex segregation, which means a real marriage with a rational foundation for the good of the state, you end up having development of geishas if you also have, I think, something like this. But the women end up, of course, resenting them. You see complaints in Aristophanes' play Thesmophoria Zeusai, the women celebrators of the festival of Thesmophoria, where they much kvetch about sluts and harlots and such that their men prefer to spend their time with. And there's this one line from Burckhardt, I think, captures the reality very well. I'm reading now, courtesans were the only women who counted for anything in social life. They could join in conversation at banquets. Their company was valued for their wit, while the daughter of the house was admired for her silence and diffidence. And in that, let me talk then about the hetairae or geishas now, because that's in some way the point of the show and one of the most striking aspects, unusual to see for a reader of ancient Greek social life. It was basically prostitute-centered social life, if I can be crude, or rather geisha-centered. How did the phenomenon start, though? And then you look at the symposium, the private party, the drinking party between, let's say, a group of friends and what later became a small fraternity of like-minded men. This was really central social institution of Greek life. It was based, Greek life, on one hand, around the agora, or the marketplace, where public affairs were discussed, business deals were made, many such things. The assembly gathered there to determine action in the state. It was a place where, quote-unquote, men win themselves note, as Homer say. And on the other hand, then there was the twin institution, these two being the central of Greek society, I think, the twin one being the private drinking party, the symposium. It exclusively took place in private homes. Men gathered to drink watered light wine. They ate light snacks, some honey cake, things of this type, and really party for many hours, discussing many things, with emphasis being again on witty and interesting conversation. not like roasty hogs who go drink now and then eat a heavy cheesesteak sandwich and then puke. My friend Blosius says this in a reply today. Yes, the Greek symposium not really comparable to a big party like American college party as you might see now in movie or such, which is much too loud, alcohol too strong, no real conversation. People are waiting for Stacy to vomit on herself and finger her or this. It was supposed instead to stimulate conversation on literature, politics, philosophy, and yes, witty banter, but a pleasant banter where cruelty, humor, mockery, affection, all of these things had their place. You can get a good sense of this from Xenophon's symposium, especially more than Plato's if you want to read it. Matters were discussed that would be considered indiscreet in, let's say, pleasurable drinking parties today, or the Europe of Burckhardt's time. The men at these parties frankly talk about their intimate emotions or about other people's love affairs quite indiscreetly and many such things, and courtesy, finery, and manners went rather in a different direction than discretion on these matters. So why I bring this up? Because the geisha or hetaira is born out of these early parties. They must have actually been a very old institution of Greek life. They took place in a kind of ritualized, they were in a ritualized form. You can find out what it is. I don't want to repeat. I think I may have described it on a show before. Very briefly, it began, you pour out libations, and then a flute girl or girls of such come in with flute and sing, and the men drink. But the flute girl was not usually a hetaira, actually. She was usually an older woman. And then later on, conversation would take place, and there would be hetairas there, as I say, who were skilled in witty talk, educated in philosophy and the arts, a large number of many such things, and were prized especially for this. As geishas, also they were prized for, they could sing well or play the harp well or other art forms and dance art forms and such, but it was really conversation-based that they were especially prized for. And, if you just sold your body, you couldn't really make it as a geisha. They had other types of prostitutes for that. And there was a glut, you see, of slave women and resident foreigner women in any prosperous port city-state from earliest times. Aspasia herself was an immigrant from Miletus, I think. Many people came to Athens and to Corinth and any other prosperous city. Same reason they go to Hong Kong or such, or New York now to make money or have a glamorous time and such. But they didn't have obviously the same benefits as citizen women did, but they also were not subject to the same laws and conventions. And the men who loved them also weren't subject to the same pressures as they were with their, dull wives. And yes, some specialized in certain arts. They were high demand. Again, as I say, even Hesiod, the farmer, who loves labor, or maybe not, but he's the farmer poet, right? Hesiod. But even he says the symposium, this party is the most pleasant thing of all in life. This discussion and talk in the banquet. But if you want to read a beautiful Mishima story, very subtle story, you read After the Banquet. It's one of his stories about Tokyo urban life. It's about a woman who runs a banquet hall and restarts the political career of a socialist and runs his campaign for president in whatever prime minister in Japan. And it's actually one of best books, I think, on modern democracy. Very subtle. In that book, Mishima really knows how to drive the stiletto in the back, very subtle way. One of the worst indictments, if you can say, I'm sorry to use cliche now, of literary cliche indictments, but one of the worst mockeries you can find of modern democracy and the role of women in democracy. Although he's quite sympathetic to this woman banquet hall owner, but I just got carried away by the word banquet. After the Banquet by Mishima, you should read it. But keep in mind also that if you are a very rich, powerful man in ancient Greece, you actually did not really have much opportunity generally to spend on magnificent things of your own and to show them. You could do it for your city, you could spend on public buildings and such, but a lot of the money, as I tell you, it got taken in high taxes for public use, liturgies so-called, really public forced taxes, especially in democracies, enormous taxation. So they had, in many cases, to hide their money. But not just democracies, in other states too, enormous taxes. So what I mean is, The greatest luxury that you could show and have in day-to-day life, the greatest pleasures were taken in just these things: symposia, banquets, parties. And as time went on, tastes became more and more refined in party form, in geishas, not so much in expensive possessions, houses, or even food and such. It was the geisha that became the greatest luxury of all, is what I'm saying. And some of these women became very famous, very rich. I read from you again Burkhardt, because it's really interesting. Women who were bought and sold had been available in large numbers from time immemorial. The rise of slavery meant that they passed rapidly from hand to hand, and slave girls were frequently presented to temples. Corinth was widely famed for its rapacious temple prostitutes, and in fact their trade was taxed as an important branch of industry. In Athens, too, there were public institutions of this kind, originally founded by Solon. I had shown him before, one of the great legislators of Athens, and I think, I don't want to say anything indiscreet about him, but Solon, who built a temple to Aphrodite Pandemos from the proceeds of these public prostitutes. The important question for us is, who was the first individual woman to become famous in this profession? And as far as we know, since we cannot tell how early the fame, for instance, of various Milesian women began, this was probably Rhodopis. Whether or not Herodotus is right in what he says of her, as Athenaeus maintains, he has confused her with Dorica of Naucratis. Perhaps no single detail about Rhodopis is safely established. A native of Thrace, she is said to have been a fellow slave with Aesop, who flourished about 580 BC. Still a slave, she was brought to Naucratis in Egypt, this was a Greek trading post in Egypt, to practice her trade, and then purchased and freed by Charaxus, the brother of Sappho. As a freed woman, she amassed so much wealth that the Greek imagination credited her with having built the pyramids of Mycerinus. Rich and independent, she conceived the great ambition of leaving a monument to herself in Greece. She dedicated a tithe of her earnings in the form of a large bundle of iron roasting spits for whole oxen, and instead of offering them at some temple of Aphrodite, she sent them to Delphi, where they were still to be found in the time of Herodotus, behind the altar of the Chians, opposite the temple. After Rhodopis had achieved her aim of becoming so famous that her name was known to everyone in Greece, it was the turn of Archidike, also from Naucratis, where, as Herodotus tells us, the Hetairae were very talented. She too was praised in poetry and was famed everywhere, but the club gossip was less concerned with her than with Rhodopis. That is, she was less highly rated by connoisseurs. Here Herodotus no doubt conveys a distinct nuance of public interest. Others who achieved fame were Leaina, the mistress of Harmodius, and Nano, the flute girl of Mimnermus. It is clear that the reputations of these Hetairae rested on their wit and conversation. Women who were merely physically attractive were too common to become famous. Perhaps even in those days, Greek men found in the Hetairae a compensation for the intelligent society that they neither expected nor found in marriage. Yes, and this expanded much beyond that age. It accelerated, in fact, in later periods of Greek life. I'm not reading now, it's just me. And here, I actually will read to you again from Burkhardt. Here's what he says. And he says it so clearly, I might as well, as I tell you, read from Burkhardt again about what happened later on in Greek history, even during Hellenistic age and so on. But to return from the imaginary figures, I'm reading now, to return from the imaginary figures of poetry to the Athenian reality, a further word must be said about the Hetairae of those times, the geishas. In earlier days, a few of them had risen to distinction by their wit and beauty, so that all Hellas knew of them, discussed them in the Lesche, and compared them. Now the Hetaira figure was moving very much into the foreground, and the type was being formed which, in the 4th century, was to produce Lais. She's a very famous prostitute geisha, you know. I shouldn't use the word prostitute. It's, if you see in Japan, you would not call the actual real geishas prostitutes. So, but anyway, I keep reading for you. As we have already said, it was not for ordinary sexual relations that the Athenians sought out Hetairae. There were other women to cater for these sexual needs. Pornai, Palakai, these are the names for the day-to-day prostitutes. The Hetaira was rather the woman whose attraction was the grace of wit, and as is well known, the outstanding example of this was Aspasia of Miletus, the friend of Pericles. How she came to Athens is not related. She is said to have followed as a rival in the footsteps of Thargelia, also a Milesian, and to have been like her, not only very beautiful, but clever as well. Pericles lived with Aspasia in great style after separating from his legal wife, and had a son by her who bore his name. She was credited with the decisive influence in the outbreak of the Samian and even of the Peloponnesian Wars, and with having trained Pericles as an orator. Let me interject here. It's funny, if you read Plutarch on this, and not just him, there were rumors that it was Aspasia that was the cause of beginning of Peloponnesian War between Sparta and Athens, in something like intrigue involving prostitutes, so that the Megarians, this was a city, Megara was a city-state, the state actually of the poet Theognis, who I mentioned earlier, but this is in a later time. What I'm talking about now, the Peloponnesian War is in a later time, and then the Megarians supposedly came and either violated or kidnapped some beautiful prostitutes that belonged to Aspasia, because she continued to be a pimp, basically, a madam, while being Pericles' mistress. And then she ordered some Athenians to do the same to the Megarians, to steal some of their prostitutes. Excuse me, Hetaira. I'm not being coy, by the way. I shouldn't do that. I shouldn't. It's as Burkhardt very clearly explains, they had entirely different functions. But you know, to me, the word prostitute is not necessarily dirty. As I have told you in the book, I enjoy their company and to also dine with them and to hear their crazy stories. You know, I'm sorry if this offends you, but let me explain something to you. Some of you who are, let's say, religious, and I like the Christian religion, I do not think that many of the saints and such were spending their time with frump housewives. And I'm not saying they were doing it for the same reason I was, but they were talking to prostitutes and such women, many of them, right? You do not find the medieval redemption stories about upstanding bourgeois housewives. They are about sinners and prostitutes. Look, I don't want to get into that now. Side tirade, excuse me. But this was the rumor that how the Peloponnesian War started, in some sordid mutual kidnapping of hetairae, of geishas, between Athens and Megara, and then Sparta was brought in after the war between Athens and Megara started, and so on. This is the rumor, but I think Thucydides probably has it right. It's just a balance, classic balance of power situation. And even if actually this was what set it off, there would have been a war between Athens and Sparta, eventually anyway. I continue read to you. Yet she was firmly believed to keep girls for public prostitution, Aspasia now, and he is just finished saying that she trained Pericles actually as an orator. Yet she was firmly believed to keep girls for public prostitution, and she was accused not only of asebeia, but also of procuring free women, not slaves, for Pericles. Asebeia, she was, in other words, accused of, let's say, what is it called in English? Blasphemy and such things. So at her trial, Pericles' tears saved Aspasia from judgment. Plutarch relates, again, I keep interjecting in Burkhardt's thing here, but Plutarch says that Pericles cried on her behalf more than he would if it was his own life. He loved her very dearly and so on. But after Pericles' death, Aspasia joined forces with Lysicles, a demagogue of low birth, whom she made one of the principal men in Athens. The younger Cyrus named his Milto Aspasia in her honor. It says much for Aspasia that Socrates could call himself her pupil, even if the tone is ironical, and it is pleasing to believe that married men brought their wives to listen to her, as for instance, according to Cicero, Xenophon brought his wife to listen to Aspasia, the hetaira, who must certainly have been an honorable woman. He means Xenophon's wife. They profited from the very best thing Aspasia had to offer, her brilliant conversation. As for the very precise accusations made against her, there is no possibility of proving or disproving them. The whole society in which she existed was too shady and too disorderly, as is seen in every page of Aristophanes. Even if she was irreproachable, we are not in a position to prove it. In any case, Pericles remained long the only Hellene in whose life a woman exercised an influence strong enough to affect all his actions. Other Greeks were at most temporarily entangled with some hetaira. And I tell you now what I told you at the beginning of this segment, I think. It would have been quite foreign to Greek attitudes to think that a man might be judged according to the kind of woman who loved him, or that an ill-fated love affair could ruin his life. An unhappy marriage might cause great misery, but lasting happiness never depended for a Greek on love and marriage. So yes, what you think about this model of life? I think is good. Let Greek be dedicated to higher tasks like annihilation. No, I don't mean that. It's a joke. I will be right back. Yes, do you like that model of life where neither women nor love, especially not something banal like marriage, is considered very important? Well, I think that you look at ancient Greece and Renaissance Italy, and you look at their immense achievement disproportionate to their rather small population, and you have to say there's something there. I have a friend, and he's married, and he has children, and he's a longtime friend. I trust him. One of the smartest people. I don't want to say who he is. But he tells me, Bap, you are complete right that women will drain all of your power in a relationship. All of your vital power, he means, his biological power. Your power, literally the energy that could go into your brain goes into stupid things because of women. And he says this is done through channels that are not widely talked about or maybe even realized, that people don't realize this is how it happens. But for example, a woman will constantly shit test you and attempt manipulations that take so much energy to counter them, to deal with the various crises and emotional crises, so that really higher life is made obscure to you. You add on top of that the clamor of children and the demands of providing for a family. And I'm sorry, I will not back down from this. I'm going to read now more from Burkhardt, because he points out how, for example, ancient Greek men did not feel the duty to provide material life to their wife or family that was, quote-unquote, in keeping with their station. So today, if you're a very rich man in Europe or United States, I would guess also East Asia, I don't know the culture very well there, but I think from what I see, they like to display cars and such. For all the supposed modesty of that part of the world, it's a plutocracy at the moment, and you go through the nice neighborhoods of Tokyo like Azabu-Juban, and the rich people there who you'd think are tasteful Japanese rich people, but they design their parking garages to display very expensive cars. And of course, you see a huge concentration in the nice parts of Tokyo of Rolls-Royce and Ferraris and such. So. But there was nothing of this incumbent on ancient Greek wealthy man to show off wealth or to pay for his wife's desires for beautiful clothing or whatever rich men have to cater to their wives now. Oh, I'm rich, I have to show for my station. There was absolutely no care given to that. So I will read from him now. It's very interesting. He says, it's interesting also that unlike in later European society, in ancient Greece at no point, a man was also not judged by the way his woman dressed or by the type of luxuries he kept in his home and so on. Because it was seen as just totally base, for example, for an important man to work to make money so that his woman could go on around in the latest fashions, you see. So I'm paraphrasing now. I'm not actually reading from Burkhardt. I'm simply paraphrasing my own take on it. But he says something very much like this. And so you don't need him to say this. You can read ancient things yourself and see that this is true. Although you should read Burckhardt's two great books of cultural history, one on ancient Greece, the other one on Renaissance Italy. And anyway, but so, I don't know. Look, fashion in the modern sense didn't exist yet even at the time. So you can look maybe to Homer, hymn to Apollo, I think talks about how magnificent the Ionian men and their women looked when they are coming on their swift ships at the festival of Delos. But aside from that, there wasn't much care given to, oh, my wife needs the latest fur coat. I guess people don't wear that anymore, but needs, you know what I mean. But Greek society declined in cultural vitality. As time went on, it became Hellenistic cosmopolitan. So at its height, you can say it was the archaic agonal age, which was aristocratic republics, then the classical age, which was mixed, some oligarchies, some democracies, but all closed city-states, closed societies, small city-states. Then after Alexander spread them around the world through his conquests, that civilization, Hellenistic cosmopolitan civilization, I would say, represent decline in the cultural vitality of Greece. It became widely spread, it became universalized, but no longer had creative power like before. And now there were imperial courts of Alexander's successors at places like Antioch, Alexandria itself, elsewhere. These were big urban centers. In many ways, they were comparable later to Rome and to modern cities even. If you want to see literature from this time, Theocritus in play Adoniazusai, the celebrators of Adonis festival, he has scenes that are very much again like you'd find in any modern big urban setting, with even at this time aristocratic women beginning to mingle in society, although not to the extent they did later in Rome. But even during this, as I tell you, less culturally vital, more cosmopolitan universalist time, the Alexandrian or Hellenistic age of the big imperial courts, what continued though was the tradition of prizing hetairae or geishas. This had been maintained, even to the extent it could be said this was a hetaira geisha-based culture, okay? They were the big celebrities of their time, the rock stars of their times and so on. So here, let me find. I will read for you from Burckhardt again, because this is interesting. Let me put in his words. For the rest, sensuality predominated in this aspect of life. I'm reading a continuation from Burckhardt is actually here talking about how homosexual love had dropped basically its idealistic or educational warrior-based form by the Hellenistic age and had become more a relationship of pleasure only or sensuality only and such and so on. And so he continues, I'm reading now. So this describes the world, from let's say the 300, I'm not reading now, I'm actually interjecting again. This describes, let me put it this way, the world of the 300s, more like 200s BC and such. The world really that Rome inherited soon from, again, the successors of Alexander after 300 BC, 200 BC, and so on. Okay, so now I am reading from Burckhardt. This is even truer of the hetairae. In other words, I'm sorry to keep interjecting, the culture of sensuality and how it, Of course, the subject of hetaira is as old as sensual enjoyment itself. But the immense public attention now paid to these women and the huge importance of them in comedy certainly exceeded what was common in the 5th century. That's the classical age of Greece, General interest was evidently enormous, which suggests how little life offered in the way of noble aims. The poets devoted themselves to every fact connected with the hetairae, whether they were slaves, hired or bought from a pimp after being suitably educated, or free women who kept a large house. This attention is often unfavorable, as when a poet compares them for rapacity and exploitation with the monsters of myth. Indeed, the attack throat. Indeed, some writers advise steering clear of the dangers and expense of frequenting them, as also of affairs with married women, when it was so easy and uncomplicated to have ordinary girls. A poet of the Middle Comedy even composed an anti-Lais. Lais was a very famous courtesan, in which he described the aging Lais with derision. Menander loved his Glycera, his courtesan, but when Philemon in a play had called the girl he loved good, he was still honest enough to reply that none of them was good. The hetairae were often mocked too for using cosmetics and other adornments to help them hide physical defects. This sounds like Twitter now. Yet the same poets also have sweet and lovable things to tell of them. They appear as charming and consoling when their lovers are out of humor, and really do honor to the name of Hetaira, a woman friend. In a fragment of Eubulus, when we read how prettily she ate, we are involuntarily reminded of the same touch in Goethe's Philine. This was the age of the great courtesans. In Greece, at least, they did not vanish into the bordello, but remained on public view. Many of their names are known to us. Athenaeus mentions 5 authors who had written books on the Athenian hetairae, including the distinguished scholars Apollodorus and Aristophanes of Byzantium. There are many anecdotes of the wit of these courtesans from these sources. He gives a citation in Athenaeus. I read Athenaeus Deipno Sophistae beginning to end, and I am aware of what Athenaeus says of the wit of courtesans. I don't really think I can read any of it for you because it's not that witty, I think. But, well, some are maybe. But so Burckhardt continues. Some quite elegant, their wit, he says, for there were well-educated women among the hetairae. One, Gnatheina, even wrote a book on table manners, a parody of philosophical works of the kind. There is no doubt that they had wit and grace, and that their conversation had a charm not found among married women. Biographical facts concerning the most celebrated, like Lais, Thais, Phryne, or Glycera, are extraordinarily hard to assess. Given that they fascinated the Greek imagination so completely, it is not surprising that the reports about them lack exactitude and are often chronologically irreconcilable. Lais, in particular, turned into a type, and it must be assumed there were at least 2 persons of that name. This was an enormously famous courtesan, later treated in plays and art and such. I keep on reading, though. She was depicted as full of malice and greed. The relationship of Praxiteles with Phryne was probably the one which had the greatest importance for art, as we have seen. According to a speech of Pseudo-Demosthenes, hetairae were for pleasure, slave harlots, palakai, for daily use, legal wives for begetting legitimate children and as reliable housekeepers. The hetaira who had a child must often have exposed it, especially if it was a girl. In Lucian's Dialogues of Courtesans, one who is expecting a child says to her lover who is deserting her that she will expose it, especially if it is a boy. But hard though it is, that she will not expose it, especially if it is a boy. But hard though it is for a courtesan, she will bring it up to reproach the father in the future for his treatment of her. There must have been a great deal in real life to correspond to the deeply felt judgment of Lysias, as follows: the day a woman abandons herself and leaves virtue behind, she strays from her destiny, considers her relatives as enemies and strangers as her friends, and thinks of good and evil in opposite terms from those she formerly believed in. End quote. In the courtesans of comedy, we find no traces of the spiritual, although there ought to be some of it if poetry wished to make use of such figures. The speech mentioned above, falsely ascribed to Demosthenes, gives a totally abhorrent picture of all the coarseness and wickedness of the real facts concerning go-betweens and whores. Yes, do you like this? I think it's both beautiful and glamorous on one hand, ugly and mercenary, cruel on the other. You know, it's one of the strangest aspects of ancient Greek life, I think. Stranger to moderns than the homo thing, because this is less known. Although I'd say also that homosexual relations as they were actually practiced is totally misunderstood by almost all sides now. But this other aspect is also maybe very alien to moderns. The extreme focus and fascination of that entire culture was on high-class prostitutes, if you want to be crude. I still think geishas is correct. And also, it's a revealing word, right? Revealing because geishas are something that actually appears. It's a word from very different societies, supposedly across the world without contact, how it happened. And I repeat to you, it happened in the same way that it happened in European aristocratic society. It comes naturally out of that, where just as in Japan and in Greece, you have a warrior caste that becomes refined in their tastes over time, and they just love geishas under whatever name you want to say them. They love them more than their wives, and certainly they become the biggest luxury and celebrities of their times. In ancient Greece, in Japan, let's say in Europe of the 1600s and 1700s. And part of it is, women Of course, I've always been loved, despite what feminists claim. The feminists almost never want to talk about this aspect, and then pedestrian social conservatives also don't want to bring attention to it either for other reasons. And but these reasons are interesting, I mean, because while I'm not presenting any of this as models in life for anyone to copy, it shows something important, that this whole geisha culture is a consequence of the fact that for aristocrats, marriage is something real and that matters, that has powerful practical foundations, rigid necessities, because it's a social and political, a real institution, I mean to say. Whereas what we have now, as a consequence of, let's say, bourgeois marriage, which with its Rousseauan delusions about family values and love as the foundation of marriage, although I should say, marriages as they exist now are not really based on love either, as they may supposedly have been in the 19th century, although they were not at that time as well. They are more like bleak arrangements between roommates with occasional sex, but at least the pretense is that they are founded on personal love. That's what I mean. But they're really bleak affairs in general right now. But again, this Rousseauan delusions about family values, in this mixture, that what happens is by our time is that it's forgotten. It's forgotten. Wait, it's actually supposed to confer you with concrete, practical, political, and social benefits. It's supposed to have actually a eugenic function. It's supposed to be an ironclad contract, an institution honored by law. It's not this thing where, the satisfaction you get is a pat on the head or the warm feeling of pleasing the woman you love or such. It actually had a purpose. And I think aristos in these societies knew better not to mix love with it. Love is fickle and capricious. Passion burns. Let me read for you. I'm close to closing this segment and the show. I will read for you a passage from Nietzsche that captures very much of what I've been trying to say on this episode. And I'm reading from Nietzsche now. Marriages among the bourgeoisie, understood in the most honorable sense of the word marriage, are no more a matter of love than they are of money, for no institution can be founded on love, but of giving two people permission to gratify each other sexually, subject to certain conditions, of course, but conditions devised with a view to the interests of society. It is obvious that among the various presuppositions of such a contract will be the parties' delight in and substantial goodwill towards each other, a goodwill shown by their willingness to be patient, sympathetic, and tender with one another. But we should not misuse the word love to refer to such a union. For two lovers, in the fullest sense of the word, even sexual gratification is nothing essential and is merely a symbol for one of unconditional submission, and for the other of his assent to that submission and of his taking possession of what has been offered. Marriage, in the noble sense of the word, marriage as antiquity understood it, was a matter of breeding a race. And is there still a nobility nowadays? And therefore a matter of maintaining a fixed and definite type which is fit to rule, to which end the desires of husbands and wives had to be sacrificed. It goes without saying that neither love nor that measure of goodwill upon which the good bourgeois marriage depends were prerequisites to such marriages. On the contrary, the interest of one's lineage took precedence, and beyond that, the interest of the class. Such a conception of marriage has prevailed in every healthy aristocracy from ancient Athens to 18th century Europe. Warm-blooded, tender-hearted creatures that we are, we moderns are scarcely able to suppress a slight shudder at the cold calculation all of this involves. But it is precisely the strictness of marriage in the aristocratic world which explains why romance, love, passion in the greatest sense of the word was invented there, while restraint and austerity were also the greatest. Yes, you see what I mean. You see, I want a gangster's mole or a courtesan for myself. I'm not telling you what to do. But remember the societies I'm talking about, for all claims that they were degenerate or whatever by a dumb modern conservative or such, or of course a leftist will always morally condemn aristocratic societies, but they lasted for hundreds of years, despite, again, you hear whether it's a leftist in the French Revolution or today with their attacks on the morality or immorality of aristocratic society. These societies lasted for hundreds of years, whereas the arrangement we have now from love-based marriage, so-called, or bourgeois marriage, as Nietzsche just described it, isn't going to last. You can see its dreadful consequences already. Worse than this, it's boring, it's lame, and compared to the great passion, the flights of passion, of fancy, the invention, as Nietzsche say, of love as great passion that you find in aristocratic societies, what we have now is the lives of dwarfs. Would you not prefer women to return to mystery of being able to be an oracle, ultimately? I say this in book. But look, this has been a long show, I hope on pleasant matters, and very good. See you soon. Until next time, BAP out!